Make sure your insurance doesn't come up short. Get gap cover with ALA. For more information, follow the links in the description.
In 1999, Aston Martin announced the end of production for their V8. And with it, they drew to a close an era of truly hand-built cars dating back to the firm's inception. But they did not wish the model and engine to go out with a whimper. Instead, they sent it out with a supernova-sized bang in the form of this. The V8 Vantage Le Mans. The most powerful, most expensive, and one of the fastest cars in the world. However, with each one costing the same as a luxury house and just 40 ever having been built, the opportunity to even see one is a rare thing indeed. To be able to drive it, almost impossible. Yet today, that is exactly what I'm going to be doing. Even better, I'll be telling you how you could get the opportunity to experience this car yourself. Curious? Find out more in today's episode of JayEmm on Cars. Depending on how you see it, the origins of this car can be traced back to either the 1980s or the 1960s, with the Tadek designed Aston Martin 5.3-litre V8 having first made its debut at the end of the 60s in the bonnet of the DBS V8. This car then being an evolution of the late 1980s Virage, one of the first cars to be launched after Aston Martin had been acquired by the Ford Motor Company. However, though technically the Virage landed during Ford's ownership, the reality was they arrived far too late to have significantly influenced the car, which was developed under the company's ownership by Victor Gauntlet. And at the time, it had very little in the way of resources. And so, though the new Virage looked all new, underneath it wasn't. The platform still dating back to the 1960s, having things like a de Dion rear axle. The styling too was controversial, and sure, it looked a lot more modern, but not necessarily in a good way. The old car's pure 1970s muscle car vibe being exchanged for an admittedly better built, but now far less pretty look. Aston Martin knew they had made an error, but it wasn't until 1993, when the company was fully acquired by Ford, they could do anything about it. And the Blue Oval had a two-pronged plan. On the one hand, they introduced a new, higher volume, lower cost model in the form of the Jaguar-based DB7. And on the other, they went to task with the Virage, turning it into the mighty and muscular Vantage. In terms of styling, the car was not unrecognisable, but significantly enhanced. It went to the gym and came back with only doors, roof and wing mirror intact from the original car. However, the most significant improvements were made, as ever, under the bonnet. Remember, this was the era of old school engineering, and there was no firm more old school than Aston Martin. And so, to give the car a shot in the arm, they took the 5.3-litre engine and strapped to it not just one, but two superchargers, raising power from somewhere in the region of 360 horses to a mighty 550 horsepower. And I remind you, this was 1994. At that point in time, the Ferrari F50 hadn't yet landed. And when it did, it came with 520 horsepower. The Ferrari 456 was some considerable way short of this. And if you wanted more, the only way to get it was with a McLaren F1. But for some, even that still wasn't enough. And so, Aston Martin introduced the V600 option, the stuff of automotive legend. Available as an option either on a new car or as a retrofit to an existing one, this would give you another 50 horsepower and 50 pounds-feet of torque, all of which was then sent to the rear wheels via a manual 6-speed gearbox. Completing the transformation to V600 spec, you then got magnesium 18-inch wheels, also a very big deal back in the mid-90s, and revisions to both the steering and brakes, which were uprated with AP racing items. And all of that was yours for £43,000 over the car's already chunky £190,000 list price, making a V600 the modern day equivalent of £450,000. Even the regular model was not exactly affordable, and that may explain the fact that in its entire production run from 1993 to 2000, they sold just shy of 280 Vantages worldwide. Why so expensive? Simple. This was the last of the old school cars built by Aston Martin over at Newport Pagnell. And although later the Vanquish was still assembled there, this was built there, with panels hand-hammered into shape by experienced craftsmen with decades of knowledge behind them. To construct one of these cars took 1,200 hours. And although, sure, the likes of the McLaren F1 and Ferrari F40 were faster, there is nowhere else in the world you could have achieved that kind of speed in this kind of luxury. Sure, automotive anoraks will point out the many repurposed elements in this car, taken from numerous other vehicles of the day, but that was the nature of a low volume production way back when. If you wanted a car like this, you were going to have to put up with the fact they were going to have to reuse some other bits from cars that cost a lot less. What you wouldn't have found in your Ford Orion though was the hides of 9 cows. And it's also got room in the back for, at least I would say, a couple of teenagers, a pretty generous boot as well, and a stereo that actually works. Best of all, you've got one of the simplest, quirkiest and coolest dashboards known to man, with here a quartet of gauges, on the left fuel, and that one moves quickly, just beside it a speedo that goes up to 220 mile an hour, next to it an enormous rev counter that peaks at 7, though in reality the engine is done and will have hit the red line long before then, and best of all, above it, nestled between the two, a little gauge that says Superchargers. To top it all off, there's even a red start button over here, and in the door sill, a plaque telling you which number of the Le Mans build this was and for whom it was built. So, what's the Le Mans bit all about? Simply put, this was the swan song for the V8 Vantage, a way for Aston Martin to celebrate their success 40 years earlier at the Great Race, and also to give customers of these cars something to remember the old school way of doing things. And to mark out a Le Mans, you've got a few visual tweaks to remind you this isn't your everyday, ordinary, average £250,000 600 horsepower Aston Martin. The most distinguishing feature of the Le Mans is this little snout grille at the front, replacing the regular one you got on the other models. Far more subtle is an extended spoiler down here, and every Le Mans also came with the handling upgrades made to the normal V600 models. But not every Le Mans is a V600. In fact, it's a little quirk of history that Aston Martin themselves never built a V600. Even if you optioned one at the factory, what they would build for you was a V550, which presumably would drive out the factory gates and then come back in to be upgraded to 600 horsepower by works service. Their way, I think, of getting around the regulations of the day. And to my knowledge, there is only one of the Le Mans which is in the regular V550 specification. The great majority of them, like this, instead are the V600. And there were a couple of options you could have had too, this one being one of just 5 cars to have them all. Although it's not like Ferrari or Aston Martin of today. The options list back then was a far simpler affair. You had your apparently infinite number of colour combinations for the exterior and interior. Here, Mendip Blue over Parchment Hide. But in addition to that, you could also have a sports exhaust system, identifiable by the quad exhaust tips at the back, and a 5-speed gearbox in place of the 6.
Another unique visual touch of the Le Mans, a restyled side grille now designed to look like that on the DBR1 race car.
For a great number of reasons, the Aston Martins of the 1990s have never been quite as well received as those that came before, or indeed those that came after. However, for those in the know, there is one model and one model alone that stands above all others. This, the Le Mans. The combination of the looks, the power and the rarity make this a car that some believe could be worth an awful lot more in the future. Not that it's cheap today, with one of these setting you back anywhere from £300,000 to £500,000. And so, there are just two questions remaining to be asked. What's it like to drive? And how exactly can you get to experience one? I shall answer that second question first, and it's all to do with this. No, not these seriously unimpressive guns. Instead, I'm talking about my NOVE watch, because this car belongs to the founder of NOVE, Alex, who, as you might have imagined, is a proper petrol head. And I have convinced him to let me take one of you out to lunch in this car. How can you get that? Well, simple. Buy a NOVE watch, any NOVE watch, using my discount code, which I'll put on screen and in the description down below, and you will be automatically entered into a draw where one randomly selected person will be taken by me for a proper British day out. I will show you one of my personal favourite roads, driven in the passenger seat of this very Aston Martin, and I shall treat you to that most fabulous of meals, a Sunday lunch. And if you've already bought one of these, don't panic. Provided you use my discount code, we will put you in the draw. All you have to do is get yourself to Stansted Airport on a mutually agreeable day, and we'll take you out for the best of British in the best of British. Can't say fairer than that. The final thing to answer then, what is one very lucky person letting themselves in for? Well, ladies and gentlemen, I don't know what the weather is doing today, but I can tell you one thing: the thunder has just arrived. Oh, you just tickle the throttle in this thing and you are made instantly aware of what lurks beneath that big and rather shapely bonnet. This is a very, very special car, although one that is at all times keen to remind you it's not quite as modern as it really should be. And the most obvious way you feel that is in the dimensions of the cabin. You can probably tell I don't have a lot of room in here. In fact, I don't even have as much room in here as I do in this car's predecessor, the old V8. It's not just in the rear seats where these are a little claustrophobic. Up front, it's pretty small too. The car itself, though, gargantuan. And while I was rigging up, I got to find out a few little extra bits of information that I'm sure you'll want to hear. And this all comes courtesy of Nicholas Me, who's been involved in the world of Astons for decades, having run his own company bearing his name since 1993, but before that working for the firm itself. And what is it I found out? Well, first off, all those prices I just quoted you, those were for the normal V8 Vantage. The Le Mans did command a premium. Exactly how much, I couldn't say, but what that might actually mean is the £250,000 figure I've been quoting you might not actually be enough. I even heard a rumour that one of these sold new for closer to £300,000. Even more surprising though, I found out that the 5-speed gearbox in here is in fact the 6-speed gearbox, but with 6 blanked off, and new ratios, courtesy of a different final drive. They've also done some work to upgrade the crown wheel and pinion, make it a little bit more durable, and he says he thinks the 5-speed setup is much better suited to the car's talents. The 6, well, top gear is just unnecessarily long, and this feels a little better suited to the car's potential sporting ability. Though in reality, I'm currently sat now doing 50 miles an hour, and the car feels fairly happy indeed. And as for the engine, though the V600 certainly does bring with it many differences, he feels that the biggest change is in fact that made to the suspension, the steering, and to the overall handling package. The whole thing being just that little bit keener. Again, it's never going to be a revelation. This is a 2-ton car based on a 40-year-old, at the time, chassis technology.
And in reality, in terms of the actual peak power figures, all they did was tweak the supercharger a little bit. It's also very possible that the regular V550 was somewhat modest in terms of its claims. I apologise too if my microphone is struggling a little bit, but though from outside this exhaust is perfectly judged, in here it's very boomy at low RPM and low speed. Turning circle though, surprisingly good for a big old bus. And I've got to say, given the fact it's a real, proper, old school, meat and potatoes car with what was massive power for the day, it's very docile. It's actually very easy to drive. It's not giving me any grief around town at all. Alright, then starts kangaroo hopping with near perfect timing, but by and large, I'm quite impressed with this. What he did tell me was significant for the V600 though, was a change to the charge cooling system. So, not only will the car make that 600 horsepower, it'll do it for longer. The system is both beefier and more efficient. And even from low down, this thing has mighty shove. You could change up at 3,000 RPM and call it a pretty quick car. But what happens if you go beyond? Oh. Now, time is a cruel mistress, and the fact is, this car just does not feel as ballistically quick as you'd expect of it. That's likely to do with the fact it is 2 tons, 600 horsepower isn't what it was, and it comes in a very linear and naturally aspirated way. While it's brisk, it's not daunting, not overwhelming, and this is definitely a car you have to give big respect. Sure, it's got a traction control button down here, but as far as I'm concerned, that doesn't mean anything. This is from the 90s, and if it does have traction, it's basic. It's also got 600 pounds-feet of torque and 285 section tyres all round that are now 7 years old. I'm not putting faith in anything. Big old thing too, this, gotta say. But feels very natural, getting very comfortable with it fairly quickly, and though you just cannot throw it around like, say, a Ferrari 550, which would have been the equivalent for Maranello of the day, it's got a very different character about it. You could easily own both and not feel like there was all that much crossover. That gearbox, very meaty. The throws, not actually too long, but the action, very heavy indeed. The engine does rev up, not too responsive, but it can heel and tow. And when it wants to spin up, it can do it quickly. Other times though, feels like it plods along. A little bit confusing that, but you very quickly get used to it. Oh, hello. A bit of straight. Let's have some fun. Oh, what a machine. Brakes are definitely the weak point. You put your foot down, you feel the front of the car dive down, so you know they're working, but it doesn't feel like you're really going that much slower. Noise is sensational though. Once you're up to speed, it's actually perfectly judged. Very cultured too. Oh. This really is like kicking an old Chesterfield off a cliff. In many regards, technically, measurably, this is not a brilliant car, but it has so much charm, so much personality about it, you cannot help but fall in love with it. And having now spent quite a bit of time with it in person, I'm really falling for the looks of the Le Mans as well. Historically, I always said it just looked a little bit daft, particularly with the intake on the front. I never really liked it all that much, but now I kinda do. Be wary though, for there are a few cars out there that look quite a lot like this, but they are not a Le Mans. And on that front, there is one other thing that Nicholas told me, which I did not know, and maybe isn't public, but with his kind permission, I am now sharing. Way back when, in 1991, while Aston was still under the stewardship of Victor Gauntlet, at that time partially owned by Ford, but not entirely, they had a full-scale clay mock-up of what was to be the Vantage. And what he saw was this, what you'd now call the Le Mans. Snout in the front, vents in the bonnet, and all. But when the new boss, Walter Hayes, came along, he looked at that and said, no, and effectively neutered it, turning it into the Vantage that was then released back in 1994. And in its defense, so successful was the redesign, it was then used as the basis for the revised Virage, now called simply the V8 Coupe. The steering in this is quite light. Got a bit of feel coming through it, but not masses. Turning isn't the keenest, but I think you'd expect that. This is the kind of car that really begs for fast, sweeping bends. The sort of thing where you can keep your foot in, knowing you've got good visibility, and most importantly, plenty of room to brake. Particularly if you wanted to have a go at that 200 mile an hour quoted top speed. Which incidentally, years later, Aston Martin admitted they never actually reached. The 200 simply a calculation. One that is possible, but nobody actually found out. They certainly made a few attempts at it, and definitely got the car beyond 180, but as for the magic 200, well, they just didn't find the space or the time for it. It is indeed possible that these cars really can do it, and to date, nobody has. Has anybody got a bit of Autobahn I can rent? I feel a challenge coming on. With a little bit of hindsight, this also becomes a very interesting car to look at. As the finale for V8 and old school Aston Martin production, it is easy to see now that they really did need to modernise things. This was effectively replaced by the Vanquish, which in terms of technology is not just a decade newer, more like 2 or 3. That's got carbon fibre in it. Okay, so does this, but basically on top of the engine for the V600 version. The chassis, well, it's basically melted down anvils. Though I did have a little bit of a panic there, got a tiny bit close to a curb, and I have been warned not to go anywhere near one. For these wheels, they are magnesium and hollow, meaning if I curb one, there's a good chance all the air is going to go out of the tyre, which is bad. What is worse is the fact that you can't really repair these, and at present, you can't really get these either. Oh dear. What I really appreciate about the power delivery is that even knowing some way through that rev range, I think at 3000 RPM, that pair of superchargers turns from bystander to willing participant, you never feel an instant change in shove. It's very linear, very predictable, and makes this a car I feel like I can trust. The ride is always a little bit harsher than you might expect. It finds every single lump and bump in the road, but the trade-off, I suppose, is the fact you do just have that little bit more confidence in the corners with this than you might in other models. The reality is, though, they're more similar than they are different. At the end of the day, though, treat this like a car from the 60s and you'll come out of it pleasantly surprised. Treat it like something from the 90s and you are doomed to disappointment. You know, there are some cars with 600 horsepower you come out of wanting a Prozac. This I come out of, and for some reason I want a cigar. Now in truth, though on paper this has a lot more punch than say a Ferrari 550, in the real world, in a straight line, I don't think it's any quicker. And around a bend, well, the Ferrari would leave it for dead. It's also worth pointing out that a 550 when new was actually cheaper than the 456. And I know some would say the 456 is the best equivalent to this because it's a 4-seater and not a 2. I don't think so. The 550 was £150,000. This, 100,000 on top. No wonder then they sold so few of them. But right here, right now, there are 100 different ways I could tell you this wasn't a great car, and Aston really probably should have replaced it 10 years earlier, maybe never even made this. I'm glad that they did. If I were to sit and look at an old Aston, I'd pick a 1980s Vantage. Think the living daylights. If I were to drive one, I think it'd have to be this. It's magnificent. Absolutely magnificent. And so, I want to say a huge thank you to the good people at NOVE for letting me drive their car. And of course, to Nicholas me for facilitating this. It's been a wonderful experience. And There's something else in their shed I'm going to drive today, and you'll find out about that in a couple of weeks. All that remains to be said is once again a big thank you to everybody involved for making this happen, and most importantly to you for watching. Don't forget to hit the like button, comment down below, subscribe if you haven't already. I shall see you for the next one. Bye bye.